The first time I found out the HOA was building on my land, I was sipping coffee on my porch and watching a hawk circle over the valley. That's when my buddy from the county assessor's office called and said, "Hey, Silas, you know there's construction permits filed under the Ridgeview HOA for 15 units. On your mountain." I nearly choked. See, I'm not part of the Ridgeview HOA, never was. My property line starts right where their community ends. I bought this stretch of mountain nearly 6 years ago, 40 acres of untouched forest, ridgeline views, and a deed so clean you could eat off it. I kept it quiet because I liked the solitude. Built a small cabin near the summit. No utilities, no nonsense, just me and the trees. But apparently that wasn't good enough for Ridgeview's HOA president, Heather Alcott. Now, Heather's exactly what you'd imagine. Mid-50s, bleached blonde bob, permanent scowl like she's smelling spoiled milk. She once tried to fine a neighbor for having a non-regulation wind chime. I ran into her at a community meeting 2 years ago when I showed up to vote down a proposed fire access road that would have cut through my land. She cornered me afterward. "You're sitting on that land like it's some sacred wilderness," she hissed. "People need vacation homes. You could be helping the community instead of squatting on a hill." I laughed her off. Thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Fast forward to that phone call. I hiked up to my ridge and sure enough, bulldozers, survey tape, and foundation stakes. I counted 5 crews working. I asked one guy in a hard hat who hired them. "Ridgeview HOA," he said, wiping his brow. "President said they secured the land last year. Zoning came through last month." I didn't argue, didn't show my deed, didn't stop them. Instead, I let them build over the next year. I watched from the tree line as they carved out roads, poured concrete pads, and framed up 15 shiny, pine-trimmed vacation cabins. They even installed solar panels and a community fire pit. A few weeks before they finished, they erected a private gate at the base of the ridge, complete with a cheesy Ridgeview Summit Villas sign. I waited until the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Heather stood in front of the new homes in a pastel blazer, cutting the red ribbon while a local news crew filmed. She gave a little speech about expanding Ridgeview's charm and responsible land stewardship. That's when I stepped out of the crowd, holding my manila folder. "Hey, Heather," I said loud enough for the camera to pick it up. "You built all this on my land." Her face froze. "Excuse me?" I opened the folder and pulled out the certified deed, the county plat map, and a notarized boundary survey. "You're trespassing." "All of this, every nail, every roof tile is sitting on property I still legally own." The silence hit like thunder. Heather's mouth hung open, but her eyes darted to the news camera before snapping back to me. "That's ridiculous," she said, voice clipped. "This land was transferred to Ridgeview Holdings last year. Our board approved the purchase unanimously." "You mean Ridgeview Holdings, LLC?" I asked, flipping to the next document. "Yeah, I saw that. You registered it yourself, but the problem is you never bought the land. You just filed paperwork saying you did." A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. The cameraman instinctively zoomed in while a few of the gathered guests started whispering. One man in a suit stepped forward, someone from the development firm, probably. "Who exactly are you?" Silas Trent. "Owner of Parcel 58, subsection D." I reached into my folder again and handed him a laminated copy of the county's GIS map with the coordinates highlighted. "Every cabin here sits on my land. You've got 6 months of construction violations, unpermitted utilities, and a few dozen environmental infractions stacked on top of trespassing." Heather's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. The developer flipped through the pages, his expression turning pale. A woman in a navy blazer, likely their project manager, pulled out her phone and stepped away. I let the silence stretch. Then, 3 sheriff's cruisers crawled up the newly paved road. Their tires crunched softly against the loose gravel as they parked just inside the gate. I didn't call them that day, the county did. I'd filed a quiet complaint weeks ago, not about the land, but about the sudden infrastructure appearing without permits. It triggered a red flag. The county building inspector sent someone up. When they found out Ridgeview Holdings had pulled permits for land they didn't own, the district attorney's office started digging. Deputy Heller stepped out of the lead cruiser, glanced at me, then addressed Heather. "We've got reports of unauthorized development on private property and fraudulent filings with the county clerk. Need you to step aside, ma'am." Heather's voice cracked, but she held onto her composure. "This is a mistake." "There must be some confusion, then it'll get sorted out downtown," Heller interrupted. "But until then, we're posting the site. This whole ridge is now under investigation. No one goes in or out." The construction crews began packing their gear without being told. The project manager was already on the phone with someone higher up, her voice sharp and panicked. Cameras caught everything. I turned to the crowd. "Just so we're clear, this wasn't a misunderstanding. They knew this land wasn't for sale. They just thought no one would stop them." Heather's husband, Warren, ambled up, cheeks flushed crimson. "You're gonna regret this, Trent. You think the county's on your side, but you're just a stubborn old—" "Careful," I said, holding up my phone. "This conversation's being recorded. Just like the emails your wife sent to the county planning office claiming she had title rights. Want to deny those too?" He stopped mid-step. Several neighbors backed away from him. See, for the past year I'd been gathering more than just paperwork. Every time a bulldozer crossed my boundary, I logged it. When they dug trenches for plumbing, I had a drone overhead. When Heather filed a false easement claim, I pulled the time-stamped rejection from the assessor's inbox. I wasn't just waiting, I was documenting. 2 days later, Ridgeview's HOA board held an emergency meeting. It didn't go well for them. By then, the story had made the rounds. Local news ran it under the headline, "Developer Builds Luxury Cabins on Stolen Land." The footage of Heather getting escorted away by deputies played during primetime. That night, a group of Ridgeview residents knocked on my cabin door with coffee, folding chairs, and a petition. "Most of us didn't know what she was doing," one said. "We're not with her, we're just trying to live here." I let them explain. Turns out Heather had been quietly consolidating power for years. She'd rewritten the HOA bylaws to allow emergency resolutions, ones that only needed 3 of 5 board member votes. She'd promised the board members investment returns by turning the ridge into a rental community. And she'd done it all without telling most of the homeowners. But here's where it got worse. The DA's office found that Heather used HOA funds to secure the construction crews. She hadn't just misfiled paperwork, she'd embezzled over $300,000 from HOA reserves to pay contractors, surveyors, and her own business partner under the fake LLC. She'd even filed backdated meeting minutes to make it look like the board had voted on it. The DA called it a textbook case of real estate fraud. The charges? Wire fraud, falsification of public documents, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to defraud. She was arrested at her house the following week. Warren tried to keep the spotlight off himself, but it didn't work. He'd signed off on bank transfers from the HOA's account under the guise of community beautification. Investigators traced the money to a shell account tied to a short-term rental firm registered in his name. They both ended up in court. Meanwhile, Ridgeview's HOA collapsed. 3 board members resigned in one night. The homeowners called a special election and formed a temporary oversight committee. They asked me to serve on it. I didn't say yes right away. I wasn't looking to get involved in politics. But then I thought about how close they'd come to stealing everything I'd built simply because they assumed no one would fight back. So I agreed on one condition, that we dissolve the HOA entirely and replace it with a voluntary neighborhood association with no enforcement powers. It passed unanimously. The new group focused on wildfire mitigation, shared tools, and hosting monthly cookouts. I showed them how to file public easement challenges and helped a retired couple reclaim a fenced-in walking trail Heather had tried to auction off. As for the cabins, the court ordered them vacated. Since they were built illegally, they couldn't be sold or rented. The judge gave me 3 options: keep them, sell them, or file for demolition. I donated 5 to a local veterans housing group. They airlifted them out piece by piece. The rest. I kept 1 for guests and removed the rest myself. Took 6 months and a rented excavator, but I didn't mind. Watching each one come down beam by beam felt like therapy. Heather and Warren took plea deals. No jail time, but hefty restitution and lifetime bans from managing finances for any community organization. The ridge is quiet again. Every once in a while, a hawk glides over, same as before. The only difference is, the people down below know where my boundary is, and they know I won't let anyone cross it again. 3 months passed after the last cabin was torn down and hauled off. The ridge was no longer buzzing with construction noise or echoing with the sound of contractors shouting over saws. Instead, it was wind and birdsong again. The occasional mountain lion track in the snow reminded me whose land this was long before me. I'd been spending more time at the cabin lately, fixing up the wood stove, sealing windows, planting wildflowers near the trailhead. But one cold morning in early February, I got a letter from the county clerk that made me stop mid-step on the porch. It wasn't from a court or a lawyer. It was a stamped, notarized notice of a property lien. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe tied to one of the removed cabins, but the lien wasn't from any creditor. It was tied directly to an entity called Ridgeview Infrastructure Recovery Fund, a name I'd never seen before. The amount: $122,000. Attached was a note stating that the Ridgeview HOA had filed a lien against my parcel for shared infrastructure costs related to road improvements, gate installation, and community security measures provided during the development period. I stared at it. This wasn't just audacity. This was a legal threat crafted after their project had already been exposed and dismantled. I immediately made calls, starting with the new interim Ridgeview Neighborhood Association. They'd already dissolved the HOA, but apparently Heather and Warren had filed the lien weeks before their arrests, using the last remaining funds in the HOA's account to retain a private collections attorney, one who hadn't yet been informed of the criminal proceedings. I drove into town and walked into the courthouse myself, paperwork in hand. The county clerk looked it over, eyes narrowing. "These are forged," she said flatly. "The lien filing references a non-existent parcel number and the notary seal is expired. That's a felony." I leaned in. "Is it enough to open a new case?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, and if they used HOA money for this, it's going to the Financial Crimes Unit." The DA's office called me the next day. A fraud investigator named Malcolm Roth took point. Quiet guy, mid-40s, with a face like he'd seen one too many tax evasion schemes. He showed up on my porch that weekend with a folder of his own. "They didn't stop with you," he said without even sitting down. 3 other residents up here got similar liens. All of them on properties that opposed Heather's expansion plan last year. He showed me copies. One for an elderly widow who'd spoken out about the environmental impact. Another for a retired park ranger who'd refused to let the HOA cut down trees near his easement. And a third for a couple who'd testified during the investigation into the illegal builds. "They were targeting dissenters," I said, reading over the forged signatures. "Exactly. It wasn't just fraud, it was calculated retaliation. And your case, as the landowner, is central to proving intent." The prosecutor's office added new charges: filing false instruments, civil harassment, elder abuse, and racketeering under the state's version of the RICO statute. Heather and Warren were both pulled back into court. But even from behind bars, Heather wasn't done. During pre-trial discovery, her defense attorney submitted a motion arguing that I had deliberately entrapped the HOA by letting them build, implying I'd orchestrated the entire thing to defraud the community and profit from the removal process. The judge called a hearing. I was summoned. The courtroom was packed a mix of neighbors, reporters, and a few stone-faced men in suits I didn't recognize. I took the stand and answered every question directly. I explained what I'd known and when, down to the day I first saw the bulldozers. I handed over the time-stamped journal I'd kept, the drone footage, the county emails. Even the video of Heather's own ribbon-cutting speech, where she declared the project a gift from the Ridgeview HOA to our future generations. The judge stared at the screen after I played that clip, then turned to her attorney. "Are you seriously suggesting the defendant was unaware she was building on land she didn't own?" He muttered something about miscommunication with county records. The judge wasn't buying it. Heather didn't look at me once during the proceedings. Her expression never changed. But Warren glared like he wanted to leap over the railing. He looked thinner now, less sure of himself. When his own attorney tried to distance him from the fake liens, the prosecution dropped another bomb. They'd traced the forged notary stamps to a rented office space in town leased under a separate LLC. One that Warren had created in his cousin's name, using a prepaid debit card and a burner phone. That's when the federal agents got involved. See, once the RICO charges were on the table, the feds had jurisdiction. A joint task force between financial crimes and postal inspection traced over $200,000 in misused HOA funds through 5 dummy corporations, most of which funneled into short-term rental platforms and offshore accounts. They'd used Ridgeview's HOA as a piggy bank to fund property flips in other states, charging the HOA for consulting fees while laundering the cash. The trial was no longer just about stolen land. It had become a case study in small-scale, organized fraud. I attended every day of the proceedings. Not for revenge, but because I wanted to make sure every homeowner who had been manipulated got to see justice unfold without being ignored or steamrolled. During testimony, a former Ridgeview bookkeeper took the stand. She'd resigned the year before the construction started, citing unusual requests from Heather. Under oath, she revealed that Heather had instructed her to backdate board meeting records, destroy paper trails, and issue checks without dual signatures. She said no one would question it, the woman said, voice shaking. That people in these neighborhoods don't read financial reports, they just want their lawns mowed and their roads plowed. The courtroom was silent. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Heather and Warren were convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced Heather to 11 years in state prison. Warren got 8. They were ordered to pay full restitution to every resident affected, including the homeowners who had liens placed under false pretenses. The court also authorized a sale of their personal assets to repay damages. Everything went. Their SUV, their 3-bedroom house, even the lakefront timeshare they'd quietly purchased under a shell company. The Ridgeview residents gathered in the community center the week after sentencing. The mood was different, not triumphant exactly, but relieved, like people waking up from a long, uneasy dream. Sarah, the retired teacher who'd organized the petition to dissolve the HOA, stood up and addressed the group. "No one person should ever have that much control over how we live," she said. "We thought we were just signing on for landscaping fees. Turns out we were handing them a blank check." Someone asked if we'd ever rebuild the cabins. "No," I said plainly. "The Ridge doesn't need more buildings, it needs time." They respected that. In the months that followed, the community started its own land trust. The idea was simple: pool together resources to protect the surrounding wilderness from future development. I donated 5 acres, specifically the area where the cabins had stood. Others added what they could. We posted new signs at the trailheads, not warning people away but inviting them in. Hikers, bird watchers, school groups. The land was open again, but this time on our terms, and the gate Heather paid to install, we left it standing. Except now, the steel arms are welded open permanently, with a wooden sign overhead that reads, "Property protected by the people who live here." Not an HOA. By early spring, the snowmelt had carved small streams through the ridge, weaving around stumps where cabins used to stand. I just finished repairing a section of the old footbridge when my satellite phone buzzed. It was Malcolm Roth, the fraud investigator. "I need you," he said. "We've uncovered something new. It's not just money laundering." He didn't explain over the phone. But an hour later, we were sitting in the county records office, deep in the basement where old microfiche reels and archived plats were stored behind dusty cabinets and humming fluorescent lights. Roth unrolled a blueprint wider than the table. It wasn't a survey map, it was a building plan marked as Phase 2. I leaned in. "This wasn't part of the 15 cabins." "No," he said. "This was planned for the eastern slope, 30 more units, but what matters isn't the number. It's what's underneath." He slid over an environmental impact report that had been submitted under the Ridgeview Infrastructure Fund's name. It was heavily redacted, but one section caught my eye: a soil treatment plan for chemical runoff mitigation. "Why would they need that?" I asked. Roth tapped a line item near the bottom. "Because they were using unapproved septic tanks, one's banned in this county since 2008. Cheaper, but they leach nitrates directly into groundwater." I stared at him. "You're telling me they buried illegal tanks on the mountain?" "Worse. They buried them on your side of the aquifer." That changed everything. The county water board had to be notified. Within 48 hours, a full inspection team arrived with ground-scanning radar and core drills. I walked with them up the ridge as they flagged coordinates and took samples. What they found was worse than expected: 9 buried tanks, all partially ruptured, some leaking into a slope that drained into the valley's primary watershed. The Department of Environmental Quality classified it as a Category 1 contamination event. That meant federal oversight. The EPA was called in. I remembered watching one of the inspectors from up by the fire circle. He stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the ridge like it was a crime scene. Because it was. By the following week, Ridgeview's name was on a federal environmental violation report. The fines alone were projected to exceed $2 million. But since the HOA had been dissolved and its funds were gone, the liability defaulted to the individuals who had authorized the project: Heather, Warren, and the 4 contractors who had knowingly installed the tanks. Now it wasn't just fraud, it was federal environmental crime. The court issued a second set of indictments. This time, the charges included illegal disposal of hazardous waste, conspiracy to circumvent environmental regulations, and falsifying compliance documents submitted to a federal agency. The contractors were arrested in different counties, one at a job site in Colorado, another trying to cross into Nevada. I testified again. But this time, my role wasn't just as the landowner. The prosecution argued that I was a whistleblower, the only reason the contamination was discovered before it reached the municipal supply down in the valley. My documentation: drone logs, dated photographs of trenching operations, and even a flagged email from a Ridgeview project manager complaining about non-compliant septic hardware, became key evidence. In court, the EPA's lead hydrologist explained that had the tanks not been caught in time, the runoff would have contaminated drinking water for nearly 400 homes. The judge didn't mince words. He called it a reckless, profit-driven operation conducted with complete disregard for environmental safety, public health, and the sanctity of private property. Heather and Warren were hit with consecutive sentences. No plea deals this time. Heather got an additional 7 years stacked onto her original conviction. Warren received 5 more. The contractors each took deals in exchange for testifying against Ridgeview Holdings, the LLC Heather had used to funnel money and file permits. What surprised everyone was that Ridgeview Holdings was still technically active. After the trial, Roth asked me to accompany him to an abandoned real estate office on the far edge of town. It had been shuttered for over a year, but the lease was still paid under the LLC. Inside, we found what looked like a marketing center: brochures, framed renderings of hilltop homes, even mock-up contracts for Summit Executive Villas, Phase 2. The kicker: The contact listed on the paperwork was someone named Danielle Alcott, Heather's niece. She was 26, had no real estate license, and lived in another state. But her name had been used to register a shadow entity, Alcott Property Solutions. A paper trail showed she'd signed off on early-stage investor packets distributed to potential buyers out-of-state people who had no idea the homes were on stolen land. The feds froze the entity and opened a parallel investigation into mail fraud and wire deception. At that point, the case ballooned into something bigger than any of us expected. A national news outlet picked it up, framing it as a story of HOA corruption and environmental disaster on privately owned land. They ran an hour-long feature with drone footage of the ridge, close-ups of the contaminated soil, and clips from my court testimony. I didn't care much for the attention, but it helped. Within weeks, a nonprofit reached out, one that specialized in restoring damaged ecosystems on public and private land. They offered to rehabilitate the ridge under a stewardship agreement. I agreed, but only if the community could be involved. So we formed a council, not an HOA, just a rotating group of volunteers, residents, a retired environmental science teacher, a few college students home for the summer. They came up on weekends, planting native grasses, reinforcing trails, and building runoff barriers. We buried the last remnants of the cabin's concrete slabs, broken pipes, rusting nails beneath layers of clean soil and stone. No signs, no plaques, just quiet restoration. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by the cabin. She brought a stack of letters, handwritten notes from residents thanking me for not giving up on the ridge. "I think we needed this," she said, handing me a folded piece of paper. "Not just the land, the reminder that we're not helpless." I unfolded it. It was a drawing from a kid down the road, crayon trees on a mountain, with a hawk flying overhead and the words, "Thanks for saving the sky." I tacked it above the workbench. By the time summer arrived, the ridge was green again. The air smelled like pine and soil instead of diesel or concrete dust. I built a simple overlook bench where the cabins used to stand, facing west. No fences, no locks. Anyone could come up. The gate remained open, still welded that way. Roth stopped by one last time before transferring to a new division. He stood on the overlook watching the clouds. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't let them build?" he asked. "I have," I said, "but then none of this would have come to light. They'd have moved on to someone else's land, someone less prepared." He nodded. "You didn't just stop them, you exposed them." As he left, he handed me a sealed envelope, a copy of the final restitution order. Over $5 million in damages spread across the defendants, with priority claims for environmental repair, legal reimbursement, and homeowner compensation. I didn't need the money. I donated every cent of my portion to the land trust we'd started. Now the ridge belongs to the community in a way it never did before. No titles, no deeds, just shared responsibility. And whenever I sit on that bench and watch the hawks circle overhead, I think about how close we came to losing all of it, not to bulldozers, but to people who thought they could rewrite the rules, hide behind paperwork, and bury their greed in someone else's soil. Turns out, the mountain had other plans.